Hello and welcome to another episode of the FemiNinja Project. And today's guest is a shining example of resilience, leadership, and purpose-driven living. His name is Eric Donoho. He is a retired U.S. Army sergeant, veteran advocate, entrepreneur, licensed real estate broker, keynote speaker, and author of the book titled Canyon of Hope: From Darkness to Dawn. Eric's military service include receiving the Purple Heart, 2 Army Commendation Medals, the Operation Iraqi Freedom Campaign Medal with Star, and the Combat Infantry Badge. He is the founder of Hand Up LLC and Hand Up Realty. Eric, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the show. I am so honored to have you.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for helping me get out my story and share a little bit of my journey with your audience. I truly appreciate it.
Yeah, as soon as I saw your bio, because we, connected on Podmatch, and the moment I saw your bio, it was like, I have got to get this guy on the show because your story is just incredible. So I'm going to turn it over to you and take it away and tell us your story.
Okay. A little bit about me. As was said in the intro, my journey in life really started when I was about 26 years old. I was working at a local radio station doing advertising and marketing, and I didn't really feel fulfilled or having some sort of purpose. And one of my sales calls was to the recruiting station to put in an order for all the ads that they would be doing. And we're in the middle of 2 wars, and young guy, I was in shape. I figured, they're going to hit me up and try to get me to join the military when I went in there. And we went through the whole process and went through the order, and nobody said anything to me. So I ended up walking out, got to my car, and then I ended up going back in and being like, hey, wait a second, guys. Like, why didn't you try to recruit me? And they were basically, they were like, well, I mean, you've got a good job. This is like, you don't strike me as the kind of person that we're going to be able to pull from that position. And so we talked a little bit about what recruiting looked like, and I was in the middle of potentially looking and moving jobs to Chicago for, upgrade in my career. And it's somewhere in the process of that, I just decided if I don't take this opportunity now, I'll never know what I'm made of. And that was really the most driving factor of why I enlisted. There are a whole lots of reasons why people enlisted, but that was right up at the top. And I wanted to see, what could I create? What could I endure? What was I made of? All of the things that, I felt were reasons that I was lacking confidence in my own self. And so in 2004, December of 2004, right after Christmas, I shipped off to basic training, airborne school. And then from there, I was stationed in Fort Richardson, Alaska. It was actually on the flight from Atlanta, Georgia to Anchorage, Alaska, that I met my wife. We actually were sat next to each other on the plane. So we had about an 8-hour flight, and we often joked that that was, our first date. We had a chicken dinner. The movie Hitch was playing for the cabin. That was when you still had a big screen in the cabin and you all watched the same movie. And so from there, I ended up at Fort Richardson, Alaska, part of the 4th Brigade, 25th Infantry Division, more specifically the 3rd Battalion, 509th Airborne Battalion, and then ended up into a Scout Sniper platoon where I was a radio operator because I had experience with Nextel before I was in advertising or before I worked at the radio station. For a lot of years, I sold Nextel phones. And because I understood radio frequency, I was
Mm-hmm.
uh, easily selected to be the radio operator, which felt fit good with my personality because I like to know what was happening anyways.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're the telephone operator for the squad, like you're always in the know, right? So if you're out in a sniper hide, you're in the know of what's going
Mm-hmm.
on. If you're in the truck drive, you're in the know. You're
Mm-hmm.
always in the know. So
Mm-hmm.
I appreciated that job and that position.
Mm-hmm.
And then in October of 2006, I deployed to Operation Iraqi Freedom. And that's where things in life really started, and the hits really started to come in life. Up until that point, I would say I lived a pretty blessed life. It wasn't that I
Mm-hmm.
didn't have my challenges. I think everyone has
Mm-hmm.
challenges. But it, the adult life challenges from that younger life are two
Mm-hmm.
totally different.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I left to go to war, my wife, who I'd met on the plane, so we got married. Um, 9 months after we met, we were married.
Wow.
And in October, when I left, we got pregnant right after we got married. And so she was around 7.5 months pregnant when I left to go to Iraq. And by the time I landed in Kuwait, because you fly there first and go to a place called Camp Buehring,
Mm-hmm.
by the time I got to Camp Buehring, I had a NCO leader of mine waiting for me outside the bus. And as soon as I got off the bus, he's like, "You got to come with me to the talk. We got a Red Cross message with you." And I found out that we had lost our son, David. So,
Oh.
because of amazing leadership, I was back. I got right back to the airport, was back on flights to Alaska, and I got back literally just hours before they needed to do the stillbirth, from a safety standpoint for my
Mm-hmm.
wife. So I made
Mm-hmm.
it home for that. And then we buried our son at Fort Richardson National
Oh.
Cemetery. And, the Army, to their credit, I know a lot of people like to always dog on the Army and DOD and all that. My experience was all positive. My leadership realized the kind of, you know, major life or
Mm-hmm.
harm this would cause. They knew that we were newly married and that this
Wow.
would be a something that could break us as being a
Mm-hmm.
married couple.
Mm-hmm.
And so they offered me the ability to stay home for 6 months,
Oh.
to heal with
Mm-hmm.
Jen and to go through it. But I'm Irish Catholic, and I deal with all my emotions with one, which is anger, and always
Mm-hmm.
had dealt with it in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that if I stayed there, I was more detrimental to our marriage than if I went back to war. So I
Mm-hmm.
acted like I was more important than what I actually was, and I ran back to war because I didn't want to deal with those emotions. And that was kind of really the start of a life I didn't really expect, of hits that would keep coming.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as I got back into combat and met up with my platoon, the first night mission I went out on was the first time I got blown up by an IED. In total, I got blown up by three IEDs. Two of them are what are called just improvised explosive devices, and one of them was what's called a explosively formed penetrator, which is meant to
Oh.
go through 10 inches of armor. Um, and surprisingly lived through each one of those. I also ended up being in a Katusha rocket attack where we were in the chow hall, my platoon and I was. It was just pretty much us. We were the last ones there eating when a bunch of rockets hit. How we
Oh.
all walked out of that scenario to still, I mean, Iraq was measured in centimeters and millimeters as far as life goes. And then you come home. And when I came home, all of that, those issues, those traumas, those explosions, everything had taken its toll, and I had pretended like I was okay the whole time. And so I made it through deployment. And by the time that I got home, they had started doing what's called post-health assessments. This is back, when the IEDs and all that stuff was in the news all the time,
Mm-hmm.
and we weren't doing enough to help soldiers and all that sort of thing.
Right.
So they created what's called a post-health assessment to try to determine who had traumatic brain injuries. And when they did my assessment, I scored off the charts. And from there, I was medically flagged, meaning they couldn't transfer me. I couldn't do anything until I was medically cleared once again. And
Mm-hmm.
that eventually then led me to being sent to what's called the Warrior Transitions Unit. And from there, I was retired in 2009. And that was supposed to be the moment where they're like, okay, I can decompress from everything that's happening, but it didn't really happen that way.
Mm-hmm.
So, and right as I was getting out, we were planning a trip to Mexico to celebrate my retirement, and my wife was doing a boot camp, and she talked me into going, and it was one of these places where I'm like, somebody's going to get hurt here, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm physically fit, I'm not. And I'm sitting here looking at this and I'm like, this is like insane. Somebody's going to get hurt here. Sure enough, like the third weekend, my wife ruptures her Achilles tendon.
Ooh.
So from there, the retirement trip to Mexico was out. And then we ended up getting pregnant again shortly after, during all of that process and rehab, and we lost that child. And
Oh, I'm
so it just
sorry.
kind of was like that for a while. My daughter was child number 4, if I remember correctly. And in total, we've had 9 pregnancies, but we have 2 children. So, um, life had its challenges all along the way from that standpoint. And then on top of that, I'd lost 17 friends that I'd known to combat. And then, in the process of coming home, that's when I started losing more and more friends to suicide.
Oh.
And so there was just hits after hits after hits. And even when I would try to dig myself out of the holes that I was in, I never really found any progress or any real healing. I would show up for
Mm-hmm.
PTSD. I would, treatment or counselings and groups, and I would do all of these different things. But ultimately, I never really found any healing. I never
Mm-hmm.
really found any kind of respite from all of the things that were bothering me. And so that was pretty much life until 2015, and at which point we had still been living in Alaska, and my
Mm-hmm.
wife's job transferred her to Indiana, where I'm from, born and raised. And so it was kind of like a coming home, and everyone thought that I would be excited about that, but I actually was really upset because I loved Alaska. I didn't want to leave Alaska. Everything about that brought peace to my life, but
Mm-hmm.
it was also allowed me to hide from people and from
Mm-hmm.
things. So we moved back to Indiana, and my background is in residential. After the military, I went to school, and my background is in residential construction.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we moved here, my mindset was just in such a negative place that the house we bought, I didn't realize I missed all the signs for how much it
Mm.
was a lemon. So
Mm.
by the December of 2015, the all of the projects that needed to happen in the house had come to fruition. There was mold, there was a mouse infestation, there
Oh.
was just, I mean, you name it, what could go wrong after we bought this house just started going wrong. I ended up having to take the entire house down to the studs and rebuild it back out, which is in the book a little bit about that journey. Um,
I'm
but
curious,
so I at
didn't you
that
have
point, I'm
I'm
sorry.
sorry. Uh, Didn't you have an inspection or an inspector before you bought the
We
house?
did. And, you know, I mentioned a few things to the inspector and he's like, no, no. And again, like
Oh,
I say I wasn't because looking back on it, I should have known better. I should have caught all of those things. They weren't things that were out of my purview. I
right,
asked questions about it. I just didn't care. I was
right,
in such a depressed state that
right.
like I I I just wanted it to be easy. I wanted it to be true. I didn't want to keep looking for houses. It
Yeah.
was just let's just do it. And in the end, there's a purpose to that. And
Mm-hmm.
I kind of skipped ahead, but by the December of 2015, my life had, I was at what I was my proverbial rock bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And my wife and I argued more than we got along. I
Mm-hmm.
was the stay-at-home dad, and the kids
Mm-hmm.
didn't really want to be around me.
Mm.
And I just got to a place where I was like, everybody will be better off without me. And so in December of 2015, I attempted to take my own life,
Mm-hmm.
and it didn't. The gun wouldn't fire. Uh, I've come to learn why now, but at the time, I just felt like it was another thing that I was failing at.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had tried and take the gun apart and look at everything. Why isn't the trigger mechanism working? I'd put it back together. I'd dry fire. Everything would work well. I'd put a round back in, and then I would try. And every time I tried to squeeze that trigger just wouldn't squeeze. Now, when I've told that story before, I've had people say, you just weren't squeezing that hard. And and maybe they're right, like I mean there's some truth to that. Maybe I wasn't. Maybe in my head, like I thought I was, but I have a pretty hair like it's a pound of pressure for a trigger
Mm-hmm.
squeeze. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not much that takes to make my
Mm-hmm.
gun fire.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, I was pretty committed. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that they're not wrong. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
saying, but in my head, this is what was happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I've come to see it as something different later on
Mm-hmm.
as I started my journey
Mm-hmm.
of healing, but it was 2 days after I tried to take my own life that my first platoon sergeant in the Scout Sniper platoon, I got word that he took his own life.
Oh.
So right at around the same time, we were both struggling, and I was really angry. I was mad that he didn't reach out. We had a falling out, so why would he have reached out? And it was so
Mm-hmm.
over something stupid. I mean, truthfully, I don't even remember what it exactly
Mm-hmm.
was over. But I mean, there were a series of things that happened while we were in the military, but we managed to stay friends. It was
Mm-hmm.
after we got out of the military that,
Mm-hmm.
it didn't happen anymore. And so I was angry and I was mad. And then the irony of the situation wasn't lost on me that I
Right.
was about to do that to my family. So it was staying up that late that night that I found out about CJ. He was number 13 for me. And I was watching TBS Rocky, and they were outside is the part in the movie where he's outside the restaurant and he's talking to his son, and you know and he says life ain't about how hard you can get hit, or life isn't about how hard you can hit, it's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. And that was the kind of light bulb moment where I'd gotten hit so many times, I just stopped getting back up,
Mm-hmm.
just laid there.
Mm-hmm.
And that was that light bulb moment where it's like, all right, I'm still here. All of these things have happened. I should be dead more times than I'm
Mm-hmm.
not. And that's not even talking about some of the things before the army, right? That you do
Mm-hmm.
as a stupid kid.
Right.
And so it's like, all right, I'm here for a reason. Maybe it's time to start exploring that purpose. And so I called my best friend, Brent,
Mm-hmm.
who still lived in Alaska and I knew would be up from the time difference. And he answered the phone in his funny voice or funny cracked up way of something like Bill's Backyard Barbecue. Will this be carry out or delivery? We've got squirrel on special today or something stupid. And I just started crying and I told him, I was like, hey, I tried to eat my Glock 2 days ago and I don't want to die, Brent. I really do want to try to live. And so it was a little awkward in the beginning because, that's not what he was expecting the call to
Mm-hmm.
be. People had no idea that's even where I was at. I mean, I guess my wife kind of knew, but everybody else just thought, I'm fine. And
So,
so,
so Eric, was it because you were hiding it so well?
no, I wasn't hiding it. Um, I wasn't, everybody knew I was struggling from like PTSD and having, a, inabilities to catch that pause between,
Mm-hmm.
the stimuli and the response. I mean, that was clear. I think everybody, but there's legitimate injuries, brain injury,
Right.
all of these things. And so it was, there was a whole lot of patience. But when it came to being suicidal, I don't know that anyone, I mean, I think Jen, my wife, she worried about it because
Mm-hmm.
she had a front row view.
Right.
But everybody else was at an arm's distance away. So
Mm-hmm.
when I'm in front of them, I'm doing my best to project a happy, healthy father and husband and trying. But the
Mm-hmm.
reality is that, um, inside it wasn't that at all. I felt like a failure. I was, not a good husband. I wasn't being the husband I wanted to be in my
Mm-hmm.
marriage, and I certainly wasn't being the father that I wanted to be. Now, there wasn't abuse or any of
Mm-hmm.
that going on. More yelling than I would care to have in my household. But again, I'm Irish Catholic, and so I grew up with it. And I'm not trying to use that as an excuse, but if you're Irish Catholic, like that's just your, like that's what it is. So, but I mean, for me, it was always internal, like beating myself up, not being enough. And
Mm-hmm.
that's really the hallmark aspects of what PTSD is. Most
Mm-hmm.
people think, oh, PTSD, and they worry, are they a danger to society or this? It's not. It's they're beating up themselves because they're trying to do better, but
Mm-hmm.
they don't know how. And
Mm-hmm.
and and that's for me, the key was figuring out this one little piece
Mm-hmm.
of information, which was a term called moral injury. And
Mm-hmm.
so once I started that path, I ended up learning a little bit. Well, somebody had brought it up to me in 2009. My wife's best friend is a Methodist chaplain in the army, and she brought it up to me after I had come home, and it just, like I'm sure whatever. I was so angry at God because of
Mm-hmm.
David and because of, what I saw at war and what people were doing to one another in his name.
Mm-hmm.
That like I was just it wasn't that he didn't exist. It was that like you've got some real problems. I don't want anything to do with you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so for me, when she brought it up, it just went straight over my head. So when I sat down and I may had that conversation with Brent, he and I stayed on the phone for hours that night, crafting a
Mm-hmm.
plan and an action point of what I would do to start healing. And he
Mm-hmm.
promised to keep it between me and him as long
Mm-hmm.
as I kept action,
Mm-hmm.
meaning he kept seeing me moving forward with action because I knew if my wife found out, whose background is in social work, she would send me straight to the VA inpatient,
Mm-hmm.
no questions. So I didn't feel like that would have been a good thing for me, and I'm not advocating that for anyone. Um, I think you need to reach out for help, and when you're in that situation, and then you need to do what's best for you and that scenario based on your situation. For
Mm-hmm.
me, and just my background, I knew that being in the hospital would be more damage than it would be good.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was committed to finding a different way. And he kept his word, and I kept my word. And that led me to a program called No Barriers
Mm-hmm.
out in Colorado, where
Mm-hmm.
you're located at.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a program at the time. Well, their program now is called No Barriers Warriors. And before it merged into what it is today, it was called Warriors to Summits. And so I climbed three different mountains over the climbing season. And there was a curriculum, there were just all kinds of different things that you had to do, pledges. It was all designed to get you out of your comfort zone
Mm-hmm.
and put you back into society, and to realize that these aren't, disabilities at all. These are actually superpowers. And if you use them in the right way, they
Mm-hmm.
can help a whole lot of people. And so No Barriers became a catalyst for me. More specifically, it was my very first trip on No Barriers that really was this realization that I was dealing with the wrong injury all the way around.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so
And
I
it,
have two questions for you.
yeah,
Number one, do you remember the names of the trails or the mountains that you summited?
I do. So the very first trip we went to the Gila National Wilderness, which is
Okay.
in New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And we were actually supposed to go to the Wind River Range, and we were going to climb a mountain there, which I'd spent a lot of time climbing there in my younger youth. So I was
Oh,
pretty
okay.
excited to go back to the
Mm-hmm.
Wind River Range. But because of the heavy snowpack that year in
Mm-hmm.
2016, the avalanche dangers were too
Uh-huh.
high, and the National Park Service pulled our permit.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of canceling the hike altogether, No Barriers, to their credit, pivoted, and they moved it to the Gila Wilderness in New Mexico. When I found out about that, I told them that I wasn't going to go, because I was like, I've already had enough desert. I don't need to go back to the
Oh.
desert. And I'm good. And my wife heard me say that to them on the phone, and she said, before you hang up, I need to talk to you, something along those lines. And long story short, she said, if you don't go, you're we're done. Like, we're not going to make it. I don't see
Mm-hmm.
us making it. You have to start putting in some work to make some changes. And this is a good opportunity. Take it. And so, long story, I ended up begrudgingly going on this trip because I didn't want to lose my family. I mean, this
Mm-hmm.
was about not losing my family.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was leaving, my wife pulled out pages from Jesus Calling, a
Mm.
book that's kind of like a daily guidepost.
Mm-hmm.
And the days that I was there, she wrote, and I was supposed to read each one of these things, and then we were going to have a discussion, because my relationship with God was non-existent, but I knew that I had faith in her. And so I was doing this to, respect what she was asking. And so I decided, though, that I wasn't going to read these passages in the morning, because I didn't want my subconscious to shape my day around those passages. I would read the passages at the end of the day and prove to her that there's no correlation.
How'd that work
And I
out for
missed the
you?
first, huh?
How'd that work out for you?
Well, I missed the first 2 days because we were kind of in transition and in hotels. And then when we finally got out on the trail, um, I caught up. And the very first one that I read just made me bawl. And again, it's in the book. But it hit me in a way that I didn't expect out on
Mm-hmm.
that trail. And so then I read the other two, and the other two mimicked those days. And as the trip progressed, I noticed myself being real quiet. And we found ourselves in a canyon, and the surroundings around us, were mimicking how I felt in life. So I'm walking in this canyon along the West Gila Fork River, and all around me is darkness, and I'm in the shadows. But at the end of the canyon is this light. And so, for me, that was the first time I had been seeing light in a
Mm-hmm.
long time. Um, I just felt like I was in this really dark place, and there was never any light. And
Mm-hmm.
so this trip was the first trip that I started seeing that light at that end. And I was like, okay, so if I can just keep going, I can reach it. And then being my passion and background being in photography, I just proceeded to try to capture one image that I could hang up in my home that would remind me that no matter how dark life gets, that there is always light at the end of that darkness
Mm-hmm.
if you just keep going. And so I snapped that picture along the way. And by the time that we got to our last night of that trip, there was a dream that I repetitively had. And I was actually worried about going on this trip because you fit everybody into these tents and you're packed in like
Mm-hmm.
sardines. And when I have this dream, I thrash around, and it's not a fun dream. It's a dream, kind of dream that when you wake up, you're sweating, your heart is beating,
Mm-hmm.
and you're just scared and fearful about everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so the last night I was there, I started having that dream. And in the mix of it, instead of doing what I did every single time in that dream, for some reason that day and in that dream, I just yelled out, God, I can't do this anymore. I need your help. And it was almost instantaneously that dream stopped. And I had what I what I experienced that night, I talk about in the book, but that was my first experience with God and Jesus. And it was life altering. And everything about that conversation that night, um, which I didn't share all of it in the book, and I never will share all of it publicly, because I think there's a time frame when all of that gets done. But it's all come true.
Mm-hmm.
Every single bit of it, and every step of the way, um, I just kept focusing on that light
Mm-hmm.
and walking. And so the next morning I woke up after the dream, which is
Mm-hmm.
just a, powerful dream. And we're heading out for the day. And the expedition leaders were like, hey, we're going to break you up and we're just going to let you walk individually for a while so that you can process this week, have some time and thoughts about how you want to approach going home,
Mm-hmm.
because that's when life gets tough. When you're out in the
Mm-hmm.
middle of nowhere, you don't have any of the stressors for life. But when you
Mm-hmm.
get back home and you have little kids and you have this and you have this, and everybody wants something from you, like, how are you going to manage this peace that you found? And for me, it wasn't even imagining, like, how am I going to, it was like processing this dream I had the night before. And as I was walking, something just caught my attention, and it made me think of my wife's friend, the chaplain,
Mm-hmm.
and made me think about the conversation that I had with her about moral injury.
Mm-hmm.
And so the way I had always explained and described life or war, when people ask me, I was like, well, I'm in the Seinfeld generation. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, I'll say it's like, imagine you're in a bubble and when we're born into this big bubble of innocence. And as we grow, people, poke our bubble, but we're able to patch it. And so little by little, that bubble of innocence shrinks. And then you
Mm-hmm.
become an adult. And the hope is that you still have some of that innocence is there. But anytime something traumatic happens, it's not a little poke, right? It is a rip. So like war is just ripping that open and saying there's no more bubble, right? Home invasion where you get attacked and beat up, that bubble is shattered. Like anything that just harms, and I always said innocence, but what I realized in that walk out is that it's not innocence at all. It's faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I had gotten it all wrong in the way that I was describing it. And the reason I'd gotten it all wrong is because I was so mad at God that I had let that anger cloud the fact that He had been walking with me every step of the way.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I got home, I decided I was going to dig into moral injury and I was going to try to figure out what moral injury is, what does it look like, and how does it, affect us. And in the process of all of that, what I learned is that moral injury often runs concurrent with PTSD, but it doesn't get healed in the same way that PTSD does through traditional means of PTSD treatments, because
Mm-hmm.
moral injury is an injury to your soul. They like to explain it online if you Google it as an injury to your moral compass. And they're trying to do that because they're trying to approach it from a non-secular point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is that, it's hard to do that when we all believe that there is some sort of spirit
Mm-hmm.
or harmony. I mean, you can just go through all the different, like when you talk about yoga, you talk about all of these things out there. It's about
Mm-hmm.
centering yourself. And that really
Mm-hmm.
comes down to that spiritual core of who makes
Mm-hmm.
us up. And in realizing that I wasn't dealing with those issues and they weren't healing, it started to make sense while I was doing all of this work for PTSD, I wasn't getting any better. So
Mm-hmm.
from that point, it became imperative for me to start looking at that moral injury and how to heal it, how to grow my relationship, but more importantly, how to grow faith, because
Mm-hmm.
that's what really heals moral injury. And so when we erode our ability to have faith in anything, then you can't trust, then you can't
Mm-hmm.
believe, then you
Mm-hmm.
don't have hope. And if you don't have hope, there is no future. There is no light. You're just in the repetitive cycle of darkness. And so that's been the real journey. And a part of that journey was, when I got to a certain point where I felt like I had enough valuable information that I could share through my story and through overcoming and growing my faith, that I would share that message and that light through my book. So that's how we got to my book, Canyon of Hope. And the cover of my book is actually the picture I took
Mm-hmm.
walking along the West Fork Gila River.
Okay, and for those of you who are not watching on YouTube, go to YouTube, check out this episode, and you can see the books behind Eric over his right shoulder and left shoulder. And it is a stunning cover. Very, very captivating and compelling.
I really appreciate that because, they're in the book world, as you know, because you're an author. Um, so I found myself, I knew that the way I wanted to tell this story, I wanted to make sure that I did it justice. And I had been trying to write a book for about over a year, and all I felt like I was doing was regurgitating my story without giving any helpful insights.
Mm-hmm.
And who am I that somebody's going to want to spend $15 to read that? Like, no, I mean, sincerely,
No, I understand.
like I want to provide value. If I'm taking money or if I'm asking somebody to spend money on something, I always wanted to make sure that like they could pull some things away that they could institute in
Mm-hmm.
their own life and not feel lectured about it, but just
Mm-hmm.
saying, oh, wow, so that's what he did.
Mm-hmm.
And those were the results. And they are able to pull for from it themselves. Like that was the key. And I just felt like all I was doing was back in like college, writing a thesis and regurgitating, but not providing that aspect. And so I, entered the actual publishing world and became really quick or clear right off the bat that this was a book that I wasn't going to work with a traditional publisher on because
Right.
I wasn't willing to give up all of my rights. There were a few
Exactly.
that were very interested, um, but they weren't willing to work with that aspect.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to own the rights.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted this story to have me to be able to control it. And then so then I was looking at the hybrid publishing world and I
Mm-hmm.
found a great publisher that I worked with. It was not always easy. It was challenging
Mm-hmm.
from time to time, but the contractors they put me in touch with to work with were top notch,
Mm-hmm.
and they helped me, see this book in a way that I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that was one of the challenges was there was a pushback on the cover because it is not a traditional type of book cover that you would see with books of like this. It's
Mm-hmm.
more of something that they wanted it more of like kind of a muted, like what you would like imagine walking into a Hudson Books in the book, like in the bookstores. You'll see what I mean. There's a trend right now where it's like a color and then maybe a drawing or something, simple, and it's just, the message, right? And I was like, that is the message.
Well, that's what I was going to say is that
That
it's
that's the
pretty clear.
message.
That is the
And
message.
in the beginning, it was like we just don't put pictures on books, right? And I'm like, no, I got faith that this is going to work out. And they're like, well, this is your book, and we're going to support you either way. We're not. I just
Mm-hmm.
want to make sure I'm leading you in the right direction. And I appreciated that they pushed back on some of these things,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, but man, even they were like, once it was done, they were like, oh, you were so right. You were so right. Because, you know, everything in life is about the picture we paint and when
Mm-hmm.
we're explaining something to someone. And the graphic designer they hooked me up with, she was, because I'm a photographer and because I work in that world, she and I were able to communicate very quickly,
Mm-hmm.
very easily. And she, I mean, like nailed it, like
Mm-hmm.
right off the bat. She gave me three options. She only needed to give me one,
Mm-hmm.
um, because she knew she had it.
Mm-hmm.
And so once they saw it, they were like, "Oh, I totally get it now." But me explaining it to them, they didn't. And that was the first realization in this process that, like, okay, I got to do a better job of, realizing that I may not be doing a good job of painting the picture. And so not to let people push back when I have a certain,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to be this way. And
Mm-hmm.
so, but it turned out great, and the reality is this first book, I'm so glad that I used them. If I did another one, would I use them again? I don't know. I have, walked through the process this time,
Mm-hmm.
so it's a little bit different. I guess it would just depend on the book and what I'm doing. But I'm thankful that I reached out to them in the first place. And I would tell anybody who's out there thinking about writing a book, if you find yourself stuck, reach out and look for a coach, reach out and look
Mm-hmm.
for a hybrid publisher. If that is something you're feeling called to do, don't, it's a lot. Like what I learned is there's a whole book science to this that I'm
Mm-hmm.
not studying. My quotes are like when I was putting things in quotations, I was still operating on like 1990s, the way you do stuff in quotations. And so, I'm so thankful I did it. But it made the book launch and the
Mm-hmm.
challenge more challenging because you spend more money.
Yes,
And
you
so
do.
now it's okay, we've got to get out there. I've got to get out there. I've got to, sell this book.
Mm-hmm.
And then what is my focus, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
it going to be real estate or is it going to be this message and moral
Mm-hmm.
injury in this book? And so I
Mm-hmm.
actually just decided that yesterday, and I'm hanging up my real estate license
Oh.
and kind of, passing that along to others.
Well, congratulations on making that decision. I mean, you have such an important story and message to share with the world that I think it's very, very powerful. And thank you for answering a question I haven't even asked yet about if you do another book, because I was wondering that the whole time. And then another question I have for you, because as you were writing the book, going through something like this, a memoir, my second book is a memoir. I mean, you really kind of experience those emotions all over again and you ride that roller coaster again. What was that like?
Um, well, so that's kind of a fun little story actually on how I did this. So I'm a perfectionist, and that's kind of like a toxic trait of mine.
Mm-hmm.
So when I sit down and write at a computer, I will like write a paragraph and then I'll reread a paragraph. And
Mm-hmm.
this is where the coaching came in. And they're like, you're not going to write a book like that, Eric. It will
Mm-hmm.
take you years to do that. You got to write a chapter, then go back,
Mm-hmm.
or just write the whole book and then go
Mm-hmm.
back.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started thinking about where my strengths are, and I'm a storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
So when I worked with my publisher, by the time I got done with working with the owner, I had a very detailed outline of what stories I was going to tell, what the lessons I hoped people would take away with, and, those type of things. So the way I approached this was I said, first off, I need to kind of step away from my life
Mm-hmm.
for a minute because as with the kids, with the hecticness of travel sports and everything along
Mm-hmm.
those lines, like I got to dial in on this. So I actually flew to I stayed at a Marriott and in a hotel for a week at Pentagon City in DC. And I just hauled up into that room, and instead of sitting down and typing, I used the dictation feature on Microsoft Word. And I told the stories as if I was giving a speech. And the problem with that is I'm a wordy talker. So, there was a lot. So when we got to the developmental edit part, that became really difficult
I'll
because,
bet.
we were trying to cut down and get it concise. And, I always like to use people's names, and this is where book science comes in. And
Yep.
it was like, no, you're putting too many characters in the book, and that
Mm-hmm.
makes it hard for people to follow. Like, we got to really think about who the characters are and the names that we use, why we use them, and all of these things, and why it's important. Um, and so some of the names I use because I really do want to give credit to those people for
Mm-hmm.
the amazing impact that they've made in my life. Because without
Mm-hmm.
them being having come into my life at the time that they had, I wouldn't be where I am today, right?
Mm-hmm.
And on the flip side, and some of them I wanted their names there because it's important that you have names for that reason, for
Mm-hmm.
that roller coaster. And so, um, And then on the same token, I got to work with a guy. His name is Michael Haig, and he's a
Mhm.
storyteller out of LA. And he's worked with Will Smith, Julia Roberts, a whole huge selection of these A-listers. And so he gave me way more time than he was supposed to.
Mhm.
We just kind of clicked. And the first chapter of my book is exactly that way because of him.
Wow.
And so I wouldn't have told it the story in this way. And
Mhm.
he's like, no, 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 no. And so like this book and the way that it does, I have to give a lot of credit to him.
Mhm.
I didn't see it in that way. I'm not
Mhm.
even so sure my publisher saw it in that way.
Mhm.
But as soon as he and we sat down and I busted out the short 20-minute version of This Is My Life. He's like, all
Mm.
right, this is what we're going to do. And we just spent time getting to know each other and talking. And by the end of it, he was like, this is what it should be. And I had already had like 6 or 7 chapters written. So I had to go
Mhm.
back and redo. And I was like, you know what? I have all the faith in the world in this guy.
Mhm.
And by the time that I got done, I was so thankful I did and that I
Mhm.
listened to him. And that was the other thing that I was going to say is, if you're doing a book and you're working with people, it is good to push back, but understand that you are paying them to give you helpful information.
Mhm.
And so I listened way more than I ever pushed back.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and so that was kind of how the roller coaster happened. And that was intentional.
Mhm. Okay, I want to read something. I can't remember if I got this from, I think, your website. I'm not sure, but that about regarding your book, that it is told with unwavering honesty. Canyon of Hope is a raw, unflinching story of survival, resilience, and redemption. That's more than just a recounting of a veteran's experiences of war. It is a roadmap for overcoming adversity, discovering inner strength, embracing transformation, and reclaiming control over your own destiny. That's
Yeah.
powerful.
Yeah. I had some help with writing that. So that's the back of the book description.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time we got to the back of the book, um, I was fried.
Yeah.
So that I can't take full credit for that back book portion. That was my developmental editor
Mm-hmm.
helping me out. Um, and turning what I had written into
Mm-hmm.
something that I think she had felt herself.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and as soon as I read it, I was like, thank you.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
it's a little one of those dirty little secrets that they don't tell you when you're an author is that how important the back of the book is and
yes.
how difficult it is to write. And you're like, wait a minute, I just wrote this, 85,000 word book and I can't come up with a blurb.
Yeah. Well, and part of it, I think, for me was so, the first kind of skipped over how it was for me when it came to, going um, through the process of writing. So for me, I knew that without revisiting each one of those stories in
Mm-hmm.
depth and being brutally honest about it and how it made me feel, right? That it wouldn't reach people.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you find yourself right back in that hole that you dug yourself out of all those
Mm-hmm.
years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But I wasn't in that hole alone while I was writing it. So
Mm-hmm.
before I wrote every day, I had a prayer that I said to God, mainly asking him for the words to shine his light through, right? Because that's really the goal here. Um, and then in doing that, um, I think I had a second opportunity to heal the right way, if that made
Mm-hmm.
any sense. That
Mm-hmm.
makes sense. You experience it the first time and you deal with it the wrong way. It's kind of just there. But then when you reprocess it and you have the opportunity to deal with it in a better way,
Mm-hmm.
um, you're able to move past it. And so there were a lot of things that I was like, okay, I can finally download this, drop it out. It's in the book.
Mm-hmm.
That's where it is. That's where it belongs. It's in the past, and my future is moving this way. So, um, yeah, yeah. And so by that time I was fried, and trying to sell that book, I was just like, I'm so fried. So I had written it, and I just didn't, the other thing I think is for that back section is that it makes it hard. Like it's hard for you to see what you've written.
Especially
Like,
after you've lived it, then you wrote it, and it's like, you want me to
right.
condense this into one very short paragraph.
Well, and it's like, I didn't see the value yet.
Mm-hmm.
The value of my book didn't start coming until, for me, didn't start coming until I started getting email messages from guys I served with who
Oh.
had read my book. And when that started happening, when
Mm-hmm.
people I served with who started saying things like, you have put things I have felt for years into
Mm-hmm.
words, and now I
Mm-hmm.
can, like, that that was when I realized that, and that was when I probably could have written that back cover
Mm-hmm.
blurb better,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, so yeah, that was is just a process. The whole thing is, even now, it's interesting as an author. I'm sure you've run into this where, you have why you wrote things.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
learned very quickly not to tell people why I wrote it,
Mm-hmm.
because then it robs them of what caused them to be connected to it.
Mm-hmm.
And there are just a lot of incidences where, you know, people latched on to something that they could identify themselves
Mm-hmm.
in, and
Mm-hmm.
then they run with it. And so when I'm talking to them, it's like I'm them, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I have that same problem, I have that same experience, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And in the beginning, it was a little weird because
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, well, wait a second, that's actually not how I meant what I wrote here.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a praying on it, and then a later conversation with my wife, that I realized that you rob somebody of their opportunity to
Mm-hmm.
connect if you try to change it. So you
Mm-hmm.
smile and you ask questions and you allow them to write. I always, this is a fun fact. So if your parents out there, one of the things that we all need to do is teach our kids to be better about asking questions and getting people to know. And this is
Mm-hmm.
a fun little thing that I do with my kids. They're at the age where they're into graphic novels and switching into the longer version of chapter
Mm-hmm.
books. And so the way that I explain life to them is to picture, their friends or the people that they meet as characters in graphic novels, except without anything written in the bubble. And it's our job as individuals to ask the questions of the people we're interacting with to fill in that bubble for us, not for us to fill in that bubble ourselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what I realized is that gives me the opportunity to allow people to just fill in their bubble and
Mm-hmm.
me get to know them in a way that probably most of their friends don't even know them.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And that's an honor.
Okay. And I have one, actually, kind of two questions for you, I think. Um, what was your wife's reaction when she read it?
Thank you for not putting words into my mouth.
Hmm. Interesting.
Um, you know, I wanted to be accurate when I
Mm-hmm.
did speak about her, and it is very difficult, as us to read it. Like, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's difficult to read it. It's emotional, right?
Right.
Because it takes you back to those moments in time.
Exactly.
Um, but one of the things that I set forth as a goal was
Mm-hmm.
that I didn't want this book to speak for Jen's experience
Mm-hmm.
because Jen's experience is very different than what my experience is.
Mm-hmm.
And something I've learned in growth and almost, we're going on 19 years of marriage this March
Mm-hmm.
and 20 years this June since we met on that Delta
Mm-hmm.
flight. So one thing that I've learned, especially in the last few years, is to not speak for my
Mm-hmm.
spouse, to
Mm-hmm.
allow her to say what she thinks and her opinions are. And I think sometimes because we get so in tune with one another, we
Mm-hmm.
can inadvertently act like our story is their story too.
Mm-hmm.
And so Jen has her own very unique story. I hope that in time she decides to write her own
Mm-hmm.
because I think it could be inspiring in
Mm-hmm.
itself. She
Mm-hmm.
has had an amazing career in her own right, and has helped more people than I probably even know about in that career. So my hope is that, down the line when we get this book paid off, that Jen can start hers. And
Mm-hmm.
and that, it's those steps. So this is the first one to get us going, and
Mm-hmm.
then, the second. It also, I think, for this book, for me and for her, wasn't to get stuck on war. I know that's
Right.
kind of the focus of the outside of the book, right? And because I wrote it specifically, when they tell you when you write a book that to get real specific on who you're writing it for. And
Mm-hmm.
so I wrote it for people like me, grunts
Mm-hmm.
who are struggling with, healing and finding that way forward.
Mm-hmm.
And in being that laser focused, make it a little bit more, about, oh, there's a picture of me in uniform on the back and that sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing. But war is only a chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And because that was only a chapter in my book. And I think so many of us veterans who come home, especially those who get injured and are dealing with PTSD and dealing with these traumas and injuries, we get so stuck in that this is our identity and this
Mm-hmm.
is who we've become,
Mm-hmm.
that becomes our whole story, and it's
Mm-hmm.
really just a chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to highlight that in the book too, to the guys.
So, Eric, where can people find you? Give us your website. How can they connect with you, get your book, et cetera, et cetera? Because now you're focusing all your attention on promoting the book and
I
doing
am.
speaking engagements. All of that is really important. So just let it rip.
They can get my book on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, anywhere you can buy your book, where you buy your books. I'm working on the audio version that should be out by the end of the first quarter. And then if you are trying to remember me, ericdonoho.com is my website. Canyonofhope.com will take you to that same website. At that website, you can buy landscape photography of mine. You can buy uh, made in America clothes and
Mm-hmm.
products. You
Mm-hmm.
can buy
Nice.
an autographed copy of the book. And you can connect with me there too. And like I tell everybody that I meet, follow me on Instagram. I'm at Donoho on Instagram. I try to put out inspiring content daily
Mm-hmm.
to help us get through, the challenges that life throws us.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. I have loved this conversation and I really, really appreciate you being here with us today. And before we sign off, do you have any final little tidbit or pearl of wisdom that you want to leave with the listeners?
Um, if you're feeling that you're called to something, there's a reason. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it's probably a good thing for you to explore that purpose. And as you explore it, don't quit. Keep going.
Mm-hmm. Excellent advice. Thank you. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you for having me. And thanks to your audience for listening to me and for engaging. And I look forward to hopefully seeing some of them interacting on Instagram with me.
I'm sure they will. Okay, as I said, thanks again. This has been absolutely an honor to talk to you and to have you on the show. And I have to say it one last time, thank you for your service. And everybody, thank you so much for listening. Please do share this episode with everybody you know, especially if you know of somebody who might be struggling with PTSD, depression, any kind of mental health issues. You know, it's so prevalent in our society, and it doesn't have to be that way. There is always a way to heal. And just remember, never give up. And that is the way of the FemiNinja.